Hello, my name is Connor.
And I'm Jason.
And you are listening to the Amaze and Perplexed podcast.
I want to welcome you back and share with you that we are in Matthew chapter 17. On the last episode, we experienced Jesus' transfiguration, the appearance of Moses and Elijah, and the response from Peter, James, and John. I think it's still noteworthy to say that in preparation for this, not preparation is not the right word, but right before this, a few days before this, Peter says in one moment, hey, you are the Son of the living God. And Jesus is like, man, that's from God. And then later he's like, you're not going to experience this death you're talking about. And he's like, get behind me, Satan. And so I just want to reinforce Jesus wasn't against Peter when he said that. He was clarifying and saying, hey, where's the message coming from? I wonder if it would serve us as a completely side note if somebody periodically would say, hey, get behind me, Satan, to me, because I'm like, oh, that's probably not from God. Now, that doesn't tie in necessarily. I am just randomly sharing. But what's happened is we're going to join them again in verse 9. We ended in verse 8 when it says, when they, Peter, James, and John, looked up and they saw no one except Jesus. We felt like 9 through 13, though, has its own content that we wanted to explore just a bit. And so that is our episode today. So in preparation for that, what crosses your mind that might be useful for us to be thinking, Connor, about, in just receiving this
Sure.
next part?
So they're going to talk about Elijah and eventually going to kind of settle on a little bit of connection between him and John the Baptist. And one of the things you read, when it kind of becomes clear that we don't really touch on in today's day and age when you read through the Gospels, if you just like sit down and read through one of the Gospels, the way that they are perceiving what God is doing in the world is filtered so much through, obviously, the Old Testament, but also the characters the people in the Old Testament. In fact, almost looking for not looking for the archetype of prophets and looking for the repeated patterns of what God did during the Old Testament and how He used specific people, and almost using the language of it almost. If you're not familiar with Jewish thought, almost sounds like reincarnation. Almost sounds like if you just take the plain translation of some versions, it almost sounds like they're looking for just the reincarnation of Elijah or Moses or whoever. And so that is, it's funny that we don't. It's interesting to me that we don't really talk about that a whole lot. But I do think it's important. I think it's important to put out in front of us that all of the people and the patterns they are waiting to see repeated in their day and age that they see in the Old Testament, that they are yearning for Elijah. They are yearning for all these patterns and God to move again and to come and get them. And Jesus will make a point here that it's like, hey, you want Elijah, you want the prophets. They were not wanted in their time. It was not pretty in their time. It was not the move that God was doing in that period of time was maybe not as glorious as or it was not as I'm trying to think of the right word. It was not received in the same way you assume it will be received today. And I think there's just one of those things, maybe it's applicable to this text. I mean, it is applicable to this text, and I think it's probably more broadly applicable to our time as just a good reminder that when we think about revivals of the past and we think about great moves of God in history, or we think about, man, even on a smaller scale, maturity that is hard won in people that we know, most of the time, the maturity that was forged in the fire of an abusive household growing up is certainly not something that we would go back and have, if we lived it, necessarily have rose-colored views, and yet it was the reality of how some beautiful maturity or beautiful growth came from. And so when I think about the disciples and the Israelites as a whole, thinking about Elijah and thinking about the prophets, I think it's just a good thing to keep in front of us. This is a human instinct that we all have, and Jesus is both recognizing that and also being like, let's also not pretend that the past didn't happen.
Right. Yeah. That is, I love you setting that up. I hadn't thought about this at all, but there's a little bit of, it's, the good old days. It's a little bit of, think even in terms of when you felt really good about your relationship with God. Mm-hmm. Man, I wish I could go back to that time. I've even known people that physically returned to places in the hopes of recapturing how good it felt. And I'm not, criticizing that. I'm just saying, I know of those things like, man, when I get back there, I think I'll feel really bit better about it. Or when I'm with these people, I'll feel better about it. And I hope in each case they do. But in most cases, it's kind of like you can't go home again, kind of feel. And it's not that you can't physically go to the place. And it's not that it will be a bad experience, but it isn't the same experience.
Absolutely.
And it is, that's interesting to me. I wouldn't have thought about this. Well, I'm going to jump in. I will read 9 through 13. So it says, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. The disciples asked him, why then did the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first? Jesus replied, to be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. So before we get there, I have to think in terms of on the chronological line here. John the Baptist is dead by this point for them. He took a brief time, or tried to take a brief time to grieve, but it just washed into everything else. So he hasn't been a primary point of discussion, at least as what's recorded here in the Gospels. So with all that in mind, what amazes you about this interaction?
Yeah, I'm going to be real. Most of my initial thoughts are all perplexion, but I think I can draw out an amazement. Previously, before in last week's reading, they have this crazy vision of Jesus, and then they're afraid of him, and then all of a sudden everything's gone, and it's just like only Jesus remains. And there's this feeling of just holiness and grandeur, and also like just deep, deep fear. And one of the things I am just I would love to have I would love to have a picture of what the walk down the mountain looked like. I would love to have so much more than we get here. And yet I am moved by the fact that one of the first things that we have recorded here after this is after the grandeur of Jesus, and after them truly getting a glimpse, and after hearing the voice of God. One of the first things Jesus talks about is suffering, is him ultimately alluding to the fact that he is also going to have to give up his life. And one of the things that I think it can become so easy in our Christianese like world of like assuming that because something happened that, oh yeah, that's just completely obvious. Of course it was going to happen. But like my sense is, if I was suddenly transported to the throne room of God, or I truly saw and heard God, that instinct of like, oh my gosh, nothing could ever tear that voice down. Nothing could ever could compete. Nothing could truly stand in the way of that voice, of that will, of that person. And I feel like you'd be captivated in fear and mesmerized. And I feel like you'd become convinced that like, we are going to win. If we're on this side, nothing could possibly stand against us. And that is true. And then for Jesus to be like, but also I will choose to allow, I will choose to suffer. I will choose to put my path down that road. And I think it's one of those things that is so, I think it's really relevant to our day and age to think about. A lot of people will rightfully talk about, man, God has won and he will win, and eventually all this will be redeemed. And that's like a beautiful picture. But how that process started was Jesus giving up his life. And then, man, how we're a part of his redemptive process is also recognizing the grandeur and the holiness of the mission of God. And then also being like, and that means that I get to suffer, and I get to have confidence in that suffering.
Yeah, I think we so easily, so readily evaluate God's work like we do anything else. If X, then Y. If God is good, if the Messiah is coming, if we've already won, then ... This should be easier, smoother, better, whatever it is. And we lose. It's like we're discussing when you were setting things up. It's this idealization of the past. Hey, we really want Elijah. And I'll tell you, and I'll go ahead and say, this is the thing that amazed me is, and it's in the text, but it's mostly my understanding. It's like when they reference Elijah, they're talking about a guy they just saw 30 seconds earlier, a minute earlier. Like, I don't know the span. Do they stay up on the mountain and regain their composure and then start walking down? There's no sense of the timing. He just says they're terrified, like you mentioned. They're looking away, everything's so bright. He's like, hey, get up. And they're like, where is he? And it's like, let's go. And then he's like, don't tell anybody what you saw. So it's a bit discombobulating. I think it's interesting. That's where their minds go, but it is that idea. Now they're like, it's so human. It's like, I just saw Elijah, and then he says the Son of Man. It's like, wait, Elijah now has a different thing. It's just like anything. I mean, we've talked, it's just common sense about if you buy a Honda today, and then you're going to notice 20 others of those Hondas, but how powerful is this that a guy that he shouldn't have seen, I'm still not clear on how he knew him, and unless Jesus said, hey, Elijah and Moses, there were no pictures, of him. Maybe he was talking in such a way it was obvious. It just occurred to me, they were speaking Hebrew. Are these guys Hebrew? Is Peter, James, and John Hebrew? I mean, they spoke some Hebrew, of course, but is it so up to, or are Moses and Elijah suddenly speaking Greek?
Or Aramaic, or whatever.
Aramaic, yeah, I mean, do they even understand what they're saying when they're discussing the Exodus like Luke tells us they are? So just so much, like you said, so much perplexing here, but that amazing... Like it's like if we walked in the room and Michael Jordan was in the room. I know of Michael Jordan. I watched him. I was a Bulls fan. He went to UNC. I lived in North Carolina at the time. All these things. And if we walked in, what would be the next thing we talked about as we walk away? Something about Michael Jordan, probably. And it's just funny that they are reacting to what Jesus said there.
Yeah.
But I'm just amazed at the humanness of, we just saw Elijah. That's who the Pharisees or the teachers keep talking about. I don't know why that is amazing to me so much, but it is.
So maybe I'll cut this out because I feel like this might be two sports metaphors, or it's two sports analogies too much in a row in terms of podcasts, because I know we did one last week. But I think about, man, if you're like how old were you in like 95, 96?
25.
Okay. And like, do you remember when Michael Jordan announced he was coming back to basketball?
Oh yeah.
And like how it was a cultural moment, right?
It was crazy.
It was it was a letter that was a press release. It was like, I'm back, or something like that. And even I was born in 95, but like I was young enough. I watched enough basketball when I was little to remember seeing Michael Jordan on the Wizards, and like, the aura, and it's just crazy. Like Michael Jordan, as somebody who loved basketball and somebody who didn't get to watch him, people talked about him as if he was God, as if he was like, he was walking above the other mere mortals of basketball. And one of my favorite things, it was a real glass shattering moment. I didn't know this, but the first year that Michael Jordan came back to the Bulls, he kind of got punked in the playoffs.
Yeah.
If you're somebody who consumes basketball content a lot, or even historical documentaries about the 90s, it's conspicuously left out that the Bulls got absolutely punked by the Magic that year,
right? And
that Michael Jordan, his first year back, and again, there's lots of reasons that he was still one of the two best basketball players of all time. So it's like, I'm not pulling anything away from him, and yet, like, when I've heard the story told of, oh, Michael Jordan comes back and then he wins 3 straight in a row, and you're like, oh, it's incredible, it's amazing, and nobody really likes to think about the fact that, there's a young Shaq that ate his lunch,
right?
And yet that was true. And I think about like when Peter, James, and John see Moses and they see Elijah, like, and they see that, like, oh my gosh, Jesus is with them, and there's a voice of God, and there's all this other stuff. Do they even forget how like Elijah was treated in his time? Like,
Right.
do they have the thing to like in their mind? Are they just like, is it like just like, oh, well, after the fact, does it all just wash over them? If Jesus doesn't say this, do they even remember? Because it's so easy with our heroes to overlook and to it's so easy to overlook and to pretend and to wash over all the ugly parts, and even the ugly parts that we participate in. And so, yeah, I'd be utterly fascinated to think like in their mind's eye when they're walking down the mountain, they're thinking about this, like, and they're thinking, oh my gosh, Jesus, Moses, Elijah, the voice of Yahweh. What? Oh my, this is my son. Don't be afraid. This is crazy. Like, I just think naturally your mind is not going to be like, oh yeah, and some things didn't work out. Things were kind of ugly at different points, and obviously things are great for Elijah now. I don't know what this. That's another perplexity we didn't talk about last week. It's like, okay, now Elijah's suddenly on the mountaintop, and it's like, but he's also not been on earth for a long. It's like, what does that look like? What is it? What do we do with that as Christians, as followers of Jesus? But also, it's like, what do you do with that if you're Peter, James, or John, and you're like, okay, things are good for Elijah. Obviously, things are good for Elijah now, but they weren't always.
Yeah, absolutely. And that makes me think, we talk a lot about when it's people we loved, can they hear us now? And sometimes, especially around funerals, people are like, oh, they can see you, they'd be so proud of you, this kind of thing. I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that's what is said. I'm also not saying it's right. I don't know. But if they can, do you think Moses and Elijah, like do they have enough of their humanity to think, so what was said after he left? You know what I mean? And Moses is like, oh, they didn't ask about me at all. That's probably, and I'm just going to jump really quickly into what perplexes me. This is such a life-changing moment. I just have to think, if I was there, and I'm trying to put myself in a Jewish mindset, that these are the heroes. If they had trading cards, if they had statues, these guys would be on them. These are the people, the lawgiver, the representation of all the prophets is right there. This has to change everything. And the first thing they're told, other than get up, is don't tell anybody. It's also interesting to me that Jesus isn't necessarily trying to make a spiritual point here. It's a point of order. It's a point of administration. Hey, I want to control how quickly this news leaks out, and I don't want it to be told until after my resurrection. Now, of course, they are still clueless. They know he's told them. That's why Get Behind Me, Satan came up. He's told them he's going to die. He's told them he's going to suffer. He's told them they're going to raise. They still don't understand it. Even at his ascension, they still don't get it. So they don't get it now for sure. But it's that idea. It's funny to me. He brings up this point of order, which is like so anticlimactic. You know what I mean? Like, hey, brother, store these things in your heart. This is beautiful. You've had an experience unlike any other. It's like, hey, don't tell nobody until something happens and you have no clue. Is that 20 years away? Is it 6 minutes away? The whole thing. I don't know. It's tonally weird. Like if I was a storyteller and I came to this point, I would think, oh, this is the literal mountaintop. This is the time. This distinguishes Jesus from everyone else on earth, that Moses and Elijah show up and say, hey, and you have witnesses. And then his first thing is to shut it down. And then their question goes here, which to me seems like, what? It's almost like if you've ever been talking to somebody and you mention bananas, and then also the next story is about bananas. It's like, this isn't significant. It's just the word bananas is in your head and your just brain went there. It's kind of like this Elijah. Hey, I saw Elijah. Hey, I have a question about Elijah. And I'm not saying there's no spiritual implication. There is. I'm just thinking purely of the human element of how conversation develops, and how if I saw something amazing and the first order of the guy in charge is, hey, don't say anything, I would argue that. I wouldn't be like, hey, tell me about this thing the teacher of the law share. So it's just it's a weird development of conversation to me.
Oh, it's incredibly odd. It's incredibly weird. One thing that my mind is naturally drawn to is I just think it's so important to remember. Like, I've not had this experience on the mountaintop that Peter, James, and John have had, but I have had experiences on the proverbial mountaintop, and yet maybe not with my words, but with my actions. I have come down from the mountain before and then denied Christ like Peter does. You know, and I just think it's one of those. I think the way that if I was in Peter's mind, like I wonder when he denies Jesus, like does he have this on his mind? Like he isn't, you know, they haven't shared this, they haven't, you know, told everybody, but is he like, oh, what about, you know, what about that moment? What is that? What could that possibly mean? What was happening when I saw that, or was he so afraid that he just forgot? But one of the things that I've become, I don't know, convinced by is the right word, but like I do feel like Peter at some point had this moment in his head, because like I have with my actions denied Christ before, and it didn't immediately. Like I didn't like immediately renounce Jesus. Like I didn't immediately go like, you know, oh, I no longer claim him, or I no longer see him, or like those experiences weren't real, or they didn't happen. They did happen, and they were real, and then I'm still with my actions denying Jesus. I'm so thankful. I'm so thankful that that this story is here for so many reasons, but just for the fact that like if I told you, like if tonight, you know, the memorial had some crazy Wednesday, we record on Wednesday, so everybody, no, I shouldn't have told anybody in case anybody was trying to come find us. Now they'll know that. Now they'll know either my house or church. We'll have to start switching locations. But like some crazy visions are had, and not just like one person has a vision, but like suddenly there are people, like everybody at Memorial is convinced, like, and there's proof. There's no gas leak in the church. There's, you know,
yeah, right.
Like we saw something, like we saw something. We all went to Paradise on Wednesday night, and then you're like, oh my gosh, that's fantastic. Well, if you had an insight into everybody's life the next day, my assumption would be that quite a few of those people would still be do some sin tomorrow.
Sure,
would still sin sin tomorrow, and it's like God pours this gift out on Peter, James, and John, and God is fully aware still of what is to come and how he's to be rejected. And I find it really beautiful. And maybe this is one of those things that's happened to me as I've become a parent, where there are times where I realize with the mood of my daughter, I was like, oh, she's going to disobey me. Like I can see some things ramping up and see some things where it's like, oh, this is going to be a problem. And yet I still, before that happens, and again, there's some things you can do to mitigate and try to help not make that happen. But sometimes there's just a freight train of disobedience coming your way and you can't do anything. But before that happens, I don't decide to just stop giving gifts to my daughter or lavishing love on her, or I don't, out of awareness that she will really bum me out from some of her decisions, decide to not to withdraw myself. And I think that's how we think about God. I think we think that God sees our sin coming or sees our failings coming, and he withdraws from us like a parent that is just so worn out because of the disobedience of his children. And it's like, I know at some point later today, Indigo will do something which will probably yell at me or yell at somebody or do something that's not good and not kind. And yet when I still get home from this recording, I'm still going to pick her up and swing her around and give her a kiss. And I think that's just, again, I don't know if that necessarily, that's not a perplexion at all. And I don't know if that speaks to what you were saying. I just am both emotionally and spiritually moved by that reality of all the parties that this is happening to, of all the awareness that Peter, James, and John have and that God has. There's so much happening here, and I'm just moved by it.
Yeah, I think that does. That's a little bit different slice of it, but it's just an implication of what I'm talking about is when we want life-changing moments, I want life-changing moments. This had to be like a life-changing moment. And two things that are interesting about it to me. Number one, they returned to sin. In other words, it doesn't change life the way you think it'll change life. Because I think there can be this almost addiction to, oh, when's my next mountaintop? Shouldn't it be better than this? Shouldn't there be more pop? You know, and then you notice, oh, God talked to Abraham like every 20 years most time. You know what I mean? It's like, are you willing to wait another 20 years for that mountaintop? You know, kind of thing. So that return to sin. And then the other thing is, and this just crossed my mind. I'm like, he tells them not to talk about it until after his resurrection. They had to talk about it some, obviously, because it's written down in 3 of the Gospels. It's amazing to me, though, this is not referenced in the book of Acts, in any of the letters, even in Revelation. I would think this would show up, especially like Peter at Pentecost, to say, hey, guys, Elijah and Moses showed up to talk about the Exodus. That's who this guy is. He's the savior of the world. I saw it with my own eyes, right? Right, James, right, John? Never pops up. I think it's fascinating. And so am I to think the ascension, not the ascension, but the resurrection of Jesus was so overwhelming that this still has value, but it became such a small thing relatively. And that's the whole thing. Is it's perplexing to me how this doesn't reshape. I cannot imagine meeting with you next week after the situation you told me about, the imaginary, hey, we're all at Memorial and all these things are happening. I just can't imagine having, number one, I'd call you the next day.
Yeah.
You'll never guess, and I'd want it written down, and I'd want it, and again, it does make it into the Gospels, which meant they told people, but still, it is that dynamic that it's like, wow, it's so overwhelming, and still, I mean, you can make a lot of cases for it. We return to our human nature. There is the slight perplexion of, why are you not telling people this? Why is Jesus trying to control this information? Which in other situations, it does not get controlled, but in this situation, it does. I guess because of the nature of the relationship, between him and his apostles versus people he's healed and doesn't know well. Anyway, it's just, the whole thing is a bit, I don't have any real answers or takeaway. It's just perplexing.
Yeah, no, that is good. It is very intriguing that there are many times where he does try to tamp things down, but there's just so many people that he can't control it. And yet this seems to be like, you would have to imagine one of the main reasons he only takes 3 is because that is a much more not controllable, it might not be the right word, but it's going to be a lot harder for that to break containment. And you do wonder, it makes me kind of imagine and wonder, like, does Jesus have similar moments with other disciples where he goes, hey, don't ever tell anybody, that's just for you and me, Yeah. I don't know, maybe it's not, maybe this is a uniquely singular event in the life of Jesus, and yet I am intrigued by that possibility, and also you would think, like, I'm sure there's personal reasons for why Jesus chooses the 3. It sounds like there's also possibly some logistics reasons of, like, hey, not everybody needs to be up here because I just know so and so is gonna blab about it or whatever,
or everybody goes and starts sacrificing on that mountain.
Yeah, that becomes the new. There's thousands of reasons.
Yeah,
and yet I think Jesus is using all these possible reasons. He is interweaving all these reasons, and not all of them are what we would consider necessarily spiritual or necessarily consider like, oh, this is what a prophet, or this is what a Messiah, or this is what a pastor would should be taking into account when he's making such an important decision. And it's like, no, Jesus interweaving both the logistic and the interpersonal and the holy, and it's all coming together. And I think that's just it's a good reminder for me that there is, as they walk up the mountain, as they experience something holy, there is a logistic choice that Jesus makes here, and I'm sure there's many reasons. But I also I don't think the fact that they're attempting to limit it is not one of them. So I'll touch on what perplexes me, and then we'll get on out of here so we can prepare for you can prepare for your Wednesday night epiphany. So I'm perplexed. I'm perplexed at the disciples' understanding. Jesus has this little riff about, like, it's not completely clear what he's saying, but I tell you, Elijah's already come. They did not recognize him, but I've done to him everything they wished. Like, if you gave me long enough, I didn't have any Bible knowledge, and I'm just reading this off for the first time, I'd be like, okay. And you tell me, hey, this is connected to somebody we've heard about in the story. I'd be like, okay. I think I would get to John the Baptist pretty quickly. But also, there's so many times throughout the Gospels where it's like, they're like, hey, Jesus, can you explain what does this actually mean? What is this? And then he says, are you still so dull? Are you not figuring this out? And so it's just interesting to me. I sometimes wonder when I read the Gospels, like, does John, when I read the Gospels, does John the Baptist not have as big of a presence in my mind as it should? Like, is John the Baptist a bigger presence in the mind of the disciples than it would be than it is when I read it? Because I read a story that has the words John the Baptist in it, and I'm like, okay, cool, time to think about John the Baptist.
Right.
But in the same way that, like, when you're reading the Bible and you're reading about it and you're thinking about how you're going to teach about it on Sunday or Wednesday night or whatever, you're going to have specific things in mind and people in mind and experiences. And so are they, when they're like, is John the Baptist much more at the forefront of their mind than I would assume?
Yeah, I love that observation. I feel the exact same way. And I also wonder, how does John and Andrew, who were disciples of John the Baptist before they were disciples of Jesus, how do they carry that? It says nothing about their grieving when John the Baptist dies. Like it's, and I think that's part of it. If you don't spend a lot of time in the Gospels, he's just another player. He's just, yes, I understand the significance because of passages like this, but he's not, tell me about the great ones in the New Testament. I don't think about John the Baptist as my top 10, And so it is well, maybe my top 10, but not my top 5. But he's about number 7.5. But it is that interesting thing about, and this is the humanity of the people. Is John the Baptist going, or is John the Apostle going, John the Baptist? And James and Peter are like, oh, you think? And he's like, yeah. I heard him teach messages. I've known it all along and haven't said it. Or now I get it. But it would be, to me, it'd be unlikely, it'd be like if there's something in your family makeup and you and Hannah and I are sitting around talking, you'd be the one to say, oh, this is how my family makeup, my family of origin, family makeup ties in here. Mm-hmm. It'd be interesting that I came up with it or she did. And I think, before you do at least. And so it is that interesting part that it would not surprise me if John the Baptist is the one that's like, or John the Apostle is the one that's like, oh yeah, he's talking about John the Baptist, but still it says we don't know, but to your point, it is interesting. Do they carry him much more precious, much more connected to the movement they're part of? Or do they perceive, that was that, not a failed effort, but he is dead. You know what I mean? And so you have to have a very strong spiritual point of, or messianic understanding. That's why I'm surprised. It feels like they pull this one right out of the hat. And that's why I'm like, oh, is it simply because they said Elijah at the temple and we just saw Elijah? Here's a question about Elijah. Or is it a deeper, man, seeing Elijah makes me think we haven't seen Elijah. Like, Elijah, and he's like, no, you have.
That is interesting. I do. I don't know if we can know, but I kind of think, I kind of am tending to agree with you. I also, man, this might take us down a hole we don't necessarily have time for, but and I think this is one of those reasons why it's so helpful for me when I actually am much more intentional about being in the Old Testament, being in the Hebrew Bible, to think about there's a sense when I read this, when they're like the anticipation and the way they feel about Moses and the way they feel about Elijah, are they, because when you read the Old Testament, you just can't help but see the rhythms over and over and over again. Like we talked about how we set it up. Are they constantly being like, well, this situation is a little bit more like Jonah, or this situation is a little bit closer to, Elijah or Moses, or I feel like we're in this part, and not in a way that somebody would think like, oh, all of history is a wheel and we just keep repeating the same mistake. But we do this in a way when we think about the different cycles that we see play out in people's lives and the lives of churches or in history in general. But would it benefit me to start thinking about it with the same imagination that the Israelites think about it? Like, oh, okay, this moment right here. And again, you'll hear people talk about it. People have their specific prophets, or we don't see the Old Testament. But this is one of those things where man, I really want to know the Old Testament, and I'll never know the Old Testament like a Jew 2,000 years ago. But man, I want to be shaped in my imagination to be shaped in the same way that it seems like these guys are shaped by it, where it is these questions how is God moving? How is it similar to how God's moved in the past? And trusting and anticipating that He is moving, and that's we'll be able to recognize when He's moving because we have these examples. And I think sometimes individual churches have language for that, especially like evangelical churches will have, specific language for that. But this is one of those areas where I kind of wonder, like more high church who have church calendar stuff, who have more tradition, where they have a leg up on us, where they have much more common language around these things than we do in the Western evangelical world. That was such a. I went down a hole and then I dug 500 feet to the side and then dug down a little bit more. But if you have anything to add to that or anything else to do with the non-transfiguration,
before you sign up, I think that's fascinating. I think there is a return to the calendar for a lot of people that weren't raised with the calendar, and I think that's an interesting thing. And I think there's probably a pendulum swing where we go from both culturally and individually, where we go from I need some physical things to rituals and things like that to I need to get away from the rituals because I'm worshiping the rituals. Even in my life experience with baptism or communion, where it's like we're not talking about baptism and communion anymore in terms of connecting with God. We're talking about these rituals and do we do them right and this kind of thing. And I think in that same way, this idea of connecting to this happened in this season or in this season. See, I don't even know the calendar enough to reference it well, but obviously we're in Lent right now, and so it's season of Lent. And how does that remind you of past seasons of Lent? What did God teach you in there? It's similar to the dynamic of Him saying, "Hey, I want you to stack stones around this." Well, why? Because I want you to remember and retell that story. So this is the question for me. I think because of fear, we neither anticipate God at work. Like, to the extent, I wonder if God's wanting to do that. Like, even saying that's like, well, what if He doesn't? So we don't say anything. And I think there is a part that, for my heritage at least, that we don't reference our stories of faith either. We don't bring out, hey, here's what God did. And how do you do that? By points of action. Why do you remember more things when you take special trips or when you, on your birthdays, these special occasions? I remember this thing around Christmas, because you're noting it with some ritual there, And so I think we lose a lot of the sense of God being alive because, number one, I don't acknowledge it in my life much, and I don't share it with other people, and they don't share it with me. How much would that explode in our lives if we're like, look, let's just not be afraid. How do you see God working? Mm-hmm. Or what has He done in the past that signals, hey, I wonder what it is? And it's using our imagination, not trusting it's going to play out just this way, but trusting the God that made it play out that way before, and like however it plays out, He's going to take care of this. I think there's something, really to chew on for me.
That's good. I appreciate that. Grace, peace, and love.